It is my pleasure to welcome you all into this session as part of the 12th International Conference for Teachers of English Language Teaching during COVID-19. It is with a great honor that I may now introduce to you Dr. Danny Glick. Dr. Glick is the Director of Pedagogical Implementation at Edusoft, a subsidiary of ETS, where he leads a team of education technology implementation specialists. Dr. Glick is also a research affiliate at the University of California, Irvine's Online Learning Research Center, where he explores ways to improve students' persistence and performance in online courses using early warning system and light touch interventions. He is a former resident scholar at the University of California, Irvine's School of Education, where he investigated the effect of learning technologies on academic achievement of low-income students. He has presented and published on various topics, including self-regulated learning, early warning system, targeted interventions, and student retention. Dr. Glick is the editor of Early Warning System and Targeted Interventions for Student Success in Online Courses, and Self-Regulated Learning and Academic Achievement in Online Courses, Theoretical Perspective and Practical Implications. We hope that you enjoy this presentation, and thank you again.
Hi, and welcome to this session on assessment for learning. My name is Dr. Danny Glick, and I'm the Director of Pedagogical Implementation at Edusoft. I'm also a research affiliate at UC Irvine's Online Learning Research Center. I'm also the editor of Early Warning Systems and Targeted Interventions for Student Success in Online Courses, and I have a PhD in Learning Technologies, and MA in Curriculum and Instruction. The best way to benefit from this session is to work as follows. First of all, make sure you have a place to write down some of your ideas as we go along. Pen and paper or an open document to type your responses will be fine. Okay, so how should we work? How should you work? While watching the video, consider the ideas being presented. When you see a task, read the questions, think, and then write down your answers for yourself. The issues raised in the task will be discussed. Finally, after you've watched the whole video and completed the task along the way, there are some questions for you to answer to help you assess how well you have absorbed the topic as a whole. All clear? Great. Let's begin. So, what can you expect to find in this session? Two approaches to assessment will be presented: summative assessment and formative assessment. We then go on to define and discuss assessment for learning and consider the benefits of this specific approach to assessment. Finally, we look at assessment for learning within the confines of online learning platforms and see what features support this type of assessment. Here is your first task. Do you know, or can you guess, what summative assessment is? Can you explain the term? Can you perhaps think of a few examples? Give yourself a moment. What summative assessment is? Can you explain the term? Can you think of examples? Take a few seconds to think about these questions and write down your answers. Okay, summative assessment. Let's look at this diagram. Teachers begin a period of study by teaching, and students learn. The process continues. Teachers teach, and students learn. Teachers teach, students study. Teachers teach, students study for the duration of the course. and the course comes to an end. The teacher prepares an assessment, a test, or a quiz. Students do the test, which is graded by the teacher, and students are given a score indicating whether they passed or failed and how well they did compared to others in the course. So one student gets 90%, another 75%, another 60%. This is the end of the process. So we can sum up and say that summative assessment is used to evaluate student learning, skill acquisition, academic achievement at the end, at the conclusion, at the end of a defined instructional period, typically at the end of the course, at the end of a semester or a program, or the end of a school year. Student achievement is usually graded and compared against a standard or benchmark. Examples might be end of year tests, end of year quizzes, perhaps a final oral presentation of a project, final portfolio of work submitted when it is complete, or even having students create a poster or infographic which summarizes a topic, and so on. We can say that summative assessment is the assessment of what students have learned. Assessment of what students have learned. Assessment of learning with the emphasis on of. Assessment of learning. Now let's look at formative assessment. What is this all about? Do you know or can you guess what formative assessment is? Can you explain the term? Can you think of examples? Like we did before, take a few seconds to think about these questions and write down your answers. Do you know, can you guess what formative assessment is? Can you explain the term? Can you think of examples? Take a few seconds to think about these questions and write down your answers. Ready? Let's see how this diagram can help understand formative assessment. First, the student is assessed, so the teacher knows what the student knows or doesn't know. The teacher then makes adjustments to the program to suit the needs of the student and teachers. The student learns, and after a while, the teacher reassesses the student's knowledge or skill to see how much is being absorbed or not. Based on the assessment, the teacher makes adjustments again, reteaches, moves faster, moves slower, adds extra work, and so on. And the process continues. This is a circular rather than linear as compared to summative assessment that we looked at earlier. So we can say that formative assessment is used to monitor student learning, skill acquisition, and academic achievement during the learning process in order to help students identify their strengths, identify their weaknesses, and target areas that need work or need attention, so that to adjust instruction to answer student needs, identifying students' weaknesses, identifying students' strength, then making instructional decisions accordingly. Examples of this type of assessment would be individual assessment of one aspect of the subject which takes place during the lesson. Project-based learning with assessment stages is another example. Process writing, where students get feedback and improve their work. A short quiz on limited content, surveys, peer assessment during a lesson, the use of checklists to self-assess, and also the use of rubrics. All these are examples of formative assessment. So we can say that formative assessment is the assessment for learning to help students learn. Assessment for learning with the emphasis on for. Assessment for learning. It is easy to understand assessment for learning if you, as a teacher, answers 3 questions. Where is the learner now? Here, we assess what the student knows or what the student doesn't know. Where the learner is going. Here you consider what the learner is expected to know, and know to yourself and to the learner what is missing in order for him or her to get there. In other words, the gap in knowledge or skill, gaps in knowledge or skill. And finally, how can the learner get there? Here you plan your lessons and provide tasks so the learner gets what is needed to close the gap that you identify, that the teacher identified before. So the process is cyclical, ongoing. So in a formative assessment for learning approach, we teach, we study, we assess. We teach, we study, and assess. Teach, study, and assess using a wide range of assessment tools, both formative, both traditional, and alternative. So students are being assessed regularly throughout the learning process, regularly throughout the school year, regularly throughout the course, not at the very end of the course, not on the last day of the term, not on the last day of the semester. Students should be regularly assessed throughout the course in order to identify areas of weakness, in order to identify at-risk students, and then make instructional decisions accordingly. So let's see if you got it all clear. Look at the table here. I'll provide you with the main features of assessment of learning and the main features of assessment for learning. And you decide which is which. Ready? All right. So this is the first one. Please read it carefully. Fixed end of lesson course evaluation. Evaluates the end result, not the process. A structured, formal process. Scores compared against a pre-decided standard. Produces a grade. The focus is on a grade. This is the other one. Please read it carefully. Ongoing, flexible evaluation, which is incorporated into the lesson. The focus focuses on the individual performance and needs of students. Produces feedback, focuses on growth, focuses on the process, not grades. Now decide which is assessment of learning, which is assessment for learning. Are you ready? Well, were you correct? I'm sure you were right. So let's move on. What are the benefits of assessment for learning? Can you list some of the potential benefits for students and teachers of the assessment for learning approach? Think also how this approach might influence the teacher-student relationship. So what are the benefits of the assessment for learning approach, of this approach for students, for teachers, for the student-teacher relationship? Like we did before, take a few seconds, think about these questions, write down your answers. What are the benefits of this approach? How this approach might influence the teacher-student relationship? List some of the benefits for students, some of the benefits for teachers, the benefits of the assessment for learning approach. All right, I'll give you 10 seconds. 10 seconds to do this. All right, So what potential benefits did you come up with? I'm sure you have lots. Here are some of mine. The assessment is likely to be focused, engaging, individualized, and valid. What do I mean by this? I will simplify this by looking at the assessment of pronunciation and reading. So assessment for learning is focused, is more focused. Specific learning goals are emphasized. The teacher may wish to check if a student pronounces long and short vowels correctly. Hat versus hate, or hop and hope. So teacher says, can you pronounce these two words, hop and hope? This is a very focused assessment. It is on a specific reading pronunciation skill. Assessment for learning is also engaging. It is engaging. It enhances student motivation. Student motivation is encouraged and enhanced. The teacher says you pronounced hop and hope correctly. Well done. Keep up the good work. Try pronouncing hat and hate. The point is evaluated and recognizes success at the simplest level on the part of the teacher, encourages and motivates the students. Assessment for learning is also individualized. It's more individualized. Following on, it's also individualized. As a result, more positive student-teacher relationships are cemented. The teacher evaluates the student's reading and says something like, I can see you're reading well now. Well done. Keep up the good work. I think you're ready for a new challenge. Do you want to try? An individualized assessment can be very positive in a teacher-student relationship. And finally, valid. That's the last point I would like to mention, that assessment for learning is also valid. Why? Because data-driven decisions can be made. Data-driven decisions can be made. Here, online platforms that collect data on student performance play an important role in assessment for learning. The teacher says, after having looked at the reports, the computer shows me high reading comprehension test scores, but low grammar test scores, especially on the use of the past tense. I've looked at your reports and I intend to assign you more practice on the past tenses and direct you to the grammar explanations for that. That's obviously what you need, okay? So here the assessment is based on data collection and can pinpoint, can highlight specific student strengths and weaknesses that need attention. In other words, feedback is more valid, feedback is more personalized, feedback is more individualized. Using data, we can identify students' strength, we can identify students' weaknesses, we can highlight and pinpoint specific student strengths and weaknesses that need attention, and then direct students to specific elements, aspects in the program, right, to help students overcome areas of weakness. All right, we're now going to move on to the online assessment tools. Online platforms provide tools and features for assessment. So let's look at some of those online assessment tools. Speech recognition, lesson tests, automated writing evaluation, open speech assessment, midterm tests, placement tests, practice tests, course tests. These are all possible assessment tools. Now let's see how we might arrange these tools chronologically, how these tools can be arranged chronologically throughout the course, throughout any given course. All right, so obviously for pre-course, we have the placement test. Students take a placement test before the course or on the first day of the course. During the course, tools giving student feedback on writing and speaking, as well as lesson tests and midterm course tests, right? These would be useful during the course and especially useful in assessment for learning using midterm tests, speech recognition, writing assignments, practice tests, quizzes, oral presentations during the course in order to identify students' strengths and weaknesses, areas of strength and weakness. And finally, a summative test at the end. Let's look at the tests in a little more detail. Let's have a look at the placement test report. All right, so we're now going to look at the placement test report. Now, the placement test establishes the starting point, the point of entry, a baseline, and in this case breaks down the student's strengths and weaknesses according to skills, reading, listening, and grammar, but provides suggested placement into a specific course, which takes those skills into consideration. For example, the last student, student 9, should start at basic 2 level. However, the placement test results provide more information and can be a kickoff point for the assessment for learning approach, right? The student is much stronger in reading than in grammar. And his teacher might already begin directing the student or directing the learning process based on these results. In other words, we use the placement test results in order to make instructional decisions. So the teacher might assign lower level grammar as review, right? Assign additional lower level grammar to bring student up to basic 2 level. Or the teacher might provide an extra reading challenge on a higher level, suggest reading magazines, articles, reading passages, reading texts on the intermediate level as a challenge. So we use assessment in order to make instructional decision. Student 9 is struggling with his grammar, right? So the teacher might assign or can assign lower level grammar to bring student up to basic 2, okay? Using assessment in order to make instructional decisions. Then we have the lesson tests that occur at the end of the lesson, at the end of the unit. So we find the lesson test reports and look at the test for a specific student. Click on class test scores, specific student. We click go. All right. And then we drill down for information. We drill down for information and we look at the test itself. We can look at the test itself and identify the student's mistakes. We can identify the student's mistakes by comparing the incorrect answers with the correct answers. In other words, teachers can compare students' answers with the correct answers and identify areas that students are struggling with. So in this case, the student is having difficulty in identifying the main idea of a passage. All right. The podcast was mainly about, this is a question where we ask students to identify the main idea of a passage or in a podcast. And the test results seem to suggest that the student is having difficulty in identifying the main idea of a passage. So using this information, I can now make instructional decisions. I need to spend more time, to devote more classroom time, right? I need to spend more time, devote more classroom time for teaching main idea or some reading strategies, helping my students build, develop, acquire, and practice reading strategies, how to identify main idea of a passage. So you're the teacher. What do we do? What do you do? If a student fails to identify the main idea expressed in a text, what might be done to help him or her develop this skill? You're all teachers. You're all experienced teachers. You must have solved this problem in the past. So what can we do? What can we do, ladies and gentlemen? Take a few seconds to think about these questions and write down your answers. Students are struggling with the reading, students struggling with the reading, right? They fail to identify the main idea expressed in a text. What might be done to help him or her develop this skill? What would you do? What can you do as a teacher in order to help the student develop their skills? I'll give you 10 seconds for this. 10 seconds to do this. Write down your answers. How can we help students develop their skills? This skill, identifying main idea expressed in a text. I'll give you 10 seconds to do this. All right. So there are different ways. There are many different ways to help students identify the main idea, including the use of online scaffolding tools. All right. In class, the teacher might ask students to differentiate main ideas from supporting details by pointing out the supporting detail and then asking students to find or express the main idea. When the student works alone or on the computer, the online platform may provide assistance, a tool which identifies the main idea. There are many tools available which enable students to develop their skills based on feedback. So you as teachers should encourage students to use the support features of the platform to improve their performance. Example, use main idea support tool to learn how to identify main idea. Now, what about speaking? What about speaking? Let's look at assessment and speaking. The student record themselves online, right? They record themselves online, and then they get automated feedback, immediate feedback, automated feedback, immediate assessment for learning, since the student can improve their performance over and over again until they're satisfied, right? So the focus here is on the process. The focus here is on the learning process, not on the outcomes. The focus is not on the grade. The focus is on the process. So then they can try, they can improve their performance over and over again until they're satisfied. And then they can send it to their teacher for non-automated feedback. The recording sent to the teacher for non-automated feedback. So the teacher then accesses the recording, listens to the recording, grades the recording, just like this. You listen to the recording, you grade the recording using a rubric. Use a rubric in the assessment process to help students identify areas of strength and weakness. All right, so again, in an assessment for learning approach, we place greater emphasis. We put greater emphasis on the learning process. All right, the learning process is more important than the learning outcomes. And as part of the learning process, we help students identify areas of strength. We help them identify areas of weaknesses, and then we direct students to specific lessons, units, components, topics, in order to help them get back on track. All right, so we have looked at some online tools to assess speaking. And the question is, how do you, as a teacher, do it? Take a moment to reflect on your own teaching. Do you assess your students' speaking skills? If so, how do you give students feedback on their speaking? How would you classify your feedback? Would you classify your feedback as assessment of learning or assessment for learning? Take a few minutes to think about these questions and write down your answers. Reflect on your own teaching. Reflect on your own teaching. How would you classify your your feedback? Would you classify your feedback as assessment of learning, focusing on the final grade, or assessment for learning, where the focus is on the learning process, helping students identify areas of weakness, all right, and directing students to lessons, units, modules, activities, exercises, which reflect their language needs, their areas of weakness. I'll give you 10 seconds to do this. How would you classify your feedback? How do you give feedback to students on their speaking? 5 seconds. All right. So you all have your own experience with oral assessment. As far as I can see, speaking is something assessed at the end of the course, and the student is given a grade for oral assessment, for oral performance. This is assessment of learning, right? This is assessment of learning when we give a grade for oral performance at the end of the process. This is assessment of learning, which is very limited, very limited. It has a very limited value, right? Speaking is something that should be assessed during the course, not at the very end of the course. Speaking should be assessed during the course, and the student should be given feedback and suggestions on how to improve oral performance, how to improve his speaking, not at the very end of the course, not at the very end of the term, but during the course. This is assessment for learning. So encourage students to respond to the speaking related feedback they receive to improve their oral skills, using teacher feedback, using automated feedback, right? And improve their oral performance. So we encourage you, teachers, to assess students' speaking and writing during the course, right? And give your students feedback and suggestions on how to improve their performance during the course, not only at the end of the course. Now, what about writing? What about writing? When we write seriously, you and I, we almost automatically write a draft. We write a draft, which is which we correct and change as we go along until we're happy with it. So we write a draft, then a second draft, a third draft. We go along until we're happy with it. Sometimes we would show it to someone else to get feedback. In other words, the writing is a process. It's a process. And so this process should be legitimized and practiced when teaching writing. We shouldn't expect students to write something correctly from the beginning to end without going through a process of correction. All right. So again, the focus should be on the writing process, not on the writing outcome. Let's have a look. Writing process. How do we define writing process? This is a process when students write a first draft. They write a first draft, then they submit the first draft for review, peer review, teacher review. They receive feedback, automated feedback, or peer review feedback before teacher review. Then the student improves his or her writing, and then they submit it to teacher. In other words, they submit or send the first draft for peer review or automated feedback. They revise the work, they rewrite their work, and then they submit the assignment to the teacher for teacher review. Now, what about the teacher? Well, the teacher reviews the writing, adds some comments or suggested correction, gives a score using a rubric, gives personalized feedback, and gives it back to the student. All right, this is a writing process, right? So process writing does not require an online automated evaluation feature to be implemented in class. Students' drafts can be assessed by teacher or by fellow students, and even by the writer, even by the student, by using a checklist. and a rubric in order to improve the work. So assessment for learning is embedded and should be embedded in the process writing, when writing is taught as a process. So again, we should promote process writing, focusing on the process. We should encourage process writing to help students identify their own areas of strength and weakness, all right, and to learn from their mistakes, right? We need to help students learn from their mistakes. All right, what type of data do you have available and what can you do with it? What can you do with this data? If your students study with an online learning platform, chances are that you have data to look at. What do you do with this data? What do you do with this data? Well, the data you may have available is completion, how much the students have done, how much of the course they have completed, lesson test average, skills, information regarding their grammar, reading, listening, vocabulary, speaking, writing, placement test, information about their placement test results, midterm, and course test, information about their final and midterm tests. Online program provide a wealth of data. The question is, what do we as educators do with this data? So let's stop and think about this. Do you regularly look at reports? Do you regularly view reports on your students to understand how your students are progressing online? If so, how do you respond to the data you have access to? Do you make decisions to change your lesson plans based on the data? Take a few seconds to think about these questions and write down a few answers. How do you use data? How often do you access data? How do you respond to the data you have access to? Make any instructional decisions? Do you change or make any adjustments to your lesson plans, to your course objectives, to the learning program based on the data? Take a few seconds to think about these questions, write down your answers. How do we use data? How often should we use data? And how can we make better instructional decisions based on that data? All right, so an assessment for learning approach for a teacher would be something like, is your class working? You should ask yourself, is your class working as you expect? Yes? Well, great. You look at the data and come to a different conclusion. No? Well, then you should ask yourself why. If your students are falling behind, if your class is not working as you expect, if students are falling behind, well, you should be asking yourself why. You drill down if necessary. You go and see what is going on. Why is my class not working as I expect? Why students are falling behind? Am I doing something wrong as a teacher? Are my students doing something wrong as students or as learners? All right, so you need to reflect on your teaching. You have to reflect on your teaching, right? And consider changing or using alternative teaching methods, right? If you're using, let's say certain grammar methods, certain grammar teaching methods for teaching grammar, using certain teaching methods for teaching grammar, and you see that your students are struggling, then consider using an alternative teaching method. All right. If you see that your students are struggling, do not continue, right, using the same teaching methods. Right. If you see that your students are struggling, you need to consider changing your teaching methods, or maybe making some adjustments to the teaching methods. Alternatively, you can consider changing your course materials. All right, so use this information, use this data in order to reflect on your teaching, in order to reflect on your learning, in order to reflect on the course materials. All right, and then you have to decide on a plan of action. All right, your plan of action would be to make sure that, for example, that you have review, right? You have to review a new grammar structure, or you should encourage students to repeat previous lessons, or you should encourage students, for example, to go back to previous units, all right, or to go back to previous lessons. In other words, you should use data, you should use the course reports in order to make instructional decisions, going back to previous units, going back to previous lessons, repeating a lesson, repeating a unit, using different teaching methods, changing the course materials, changing instructional methods or teaching methods, all right? Use data in order to make decisions, in order to make instructional decisions. All right, so use reports at the class level, at the student level to promote evidence-based instruction, evidence-based instruction. Online reports, ladies and gentlemen, can provide both summative and formative information. Both are useful when teaching. So after reviewing the reports, the teacher might need to make adjustments. Let's have a look. Now, the adjustments might be for the student, all right, a response aimed at providing direction for a particular student. The adjustment might be for a class, a response aimed at providing direction to a class as a whole at the class level. And in some cases, the adjustment might be for the program, a response aimed at reconsidering aspects of a program that don't seem to be working. All right. For the students, you might need to give student individual instruction or assign extra different components to a student, again, based on the reports, based on data that you've been analyzing or data that you've been looking at. For the class, you might need to review topics already taught or assign extra and different components to the whole class. And for the program, you might need to decide to reteach a topic or to deviate from the planned program. In other words, as a classroom teacher or as an online teacher, we should be looking and analyzing reports regularly throughout the course, regularly during the course, and then make instructional decisions accordingly. Decisions at the individual student level, at the class level, at the program level. Students are assessed and receive feedback as well. What are their options? Let's have a look. So students get automated feedback from the online program. Okay. Students get feedback from the teacher. So students get feedback from the program and from the teacher. In both cases, the student needs to consider the feedback and make the necessary adjustment in order to progress. In other words, students should reflect on their own learning. They should reflect on their learning, right? They should consider the feedback, both the automated feedback and the teacher-given feedback, right? And make adjustments in order to progress. That is how the student applies assessment for learning, by considering feedback, identifying their own weaknesses, reflecting on their learning, and then making decisions accordingly, applying, making adjustments in order to progress. This is how students apply assessment for learning. With regard to the automated feedback, students review test results. They review the automated writing evaluation feedback, right? They should look at the student dashboard, identify areas of weakness. With regard to the teacher, they get score and comments for the writing and speaking and anything else the teacher would like to say. All right, so students should use this data. They should use this information, right, in order to reflect on their learning, identify weaknesses, and then make adjustments accordingly, make decisions accordingly. In conclusion, Assessment for learning, ladies and gentlemen, is used to monitor students' learning during the learning process, throughout the course, not at the end of the course, but during the course, in order to help students identify their strengths and weaknesses and address areas and target areas that need work, that need attention, and to adjust instruction to answer the student needs. So we encourage you to consider how you can best help your students improve by applying the assessment for learning approach, by analyzing student progress reports, by identifying their strengths and weaknesses, and then targeting areas that need work, making instructional decisions accordingly. Ladies and gentlemen, this session is almost over. There are some questions for you to answer to assess your own understanding of the assessment for learning model. So here is your first question. Let's read the question. Which of the following is true? Summative assessment is assessment of learning. Summative assessment is assessment for learning. Summative assessment uses rubrics and checklists, or summative assessment monitors student learning regularly. So which of the following statements is true? I'll give you 10 seconds to do this. Which of the following statements about summative assessment is true? Is it A, B, C, or D? I'll give you 5 seconds to do this. And the answer is A. Summative assessment is assessment of learning. Assessment for learning is summative assessment. Here is your second question. Let's read the question. Which of the following statements is true? Formative assessment is assessment of learning? Or is it formative assessment is assessment for learning? Is it C, formative assessment uses rubrics and checklists? Or is it D, formative assessment monitors student learning regularly? I'll give you 10 seconds to do this. Which of the following statements about formative assessment is true? And the correct answer is B. Formative assessment is assessment for learning, where students are assessed during the course in order to identify areas of strength and weakness. Moving on to question number 3. Which of the following is not true? Which of the following 4 statements, which of the following statements is not true? Assessment for learning is cyclical rather than linear. Assessment for learning focuses on growth rather than grades. Assessment for learning is used to help identify specific strengths and weaknesses. Or is it D, assessment for learning is used to decide whether a student passes or fails a course of study? Which of the following is not true? 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. And the correct answer is D, which is not true. Assessment for learning is used to decide whether a student passes or fails a course of study. Not true. All right, moving on to question 4. Question number 4. Which of the following assessment features support an assessment for learning approach? Which of the following features support an assessment for learning approach? Is it A, data from a dashboard and reports? Does this feature support assessment for learning? Is it B, feedback on speaking? Does this feature support assessment for learning? Is it C, writing tasks? Do writing tasks support and promote assessment for learning? Or is it D, all of the answers are correct? The correct answer is D, all of the answers are correct, right? We can use data from dashboard, from reports, from speaking, from writing, in order to identify students' weaknesses, in order to make instructional decisions, in order to reflect on the course, reflect on our teaching. Finally, question 5, which of the following benefits would you expect with an assessment for learning approach? Which of the following benefits would you expect with an assessment for learning approach? Is it A, positive student-teacher relationships? Is it B, a focus on specific learning goals? Is it C, enhanced student motivation? Or is it D, all of the answers? All the answers are correct. Which of the following benefits would you expect with assessment for learning approach? And the answer is, the correct answer is D, all the answers are correct. It promotes, right, fosters more positive student relationships, student-teacher relationships. It is more individualized, more focused. It enhances student motivation. It is more individualized and personalized, and it is more valid. So all the answers are correct. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings today's session to an end. I would like to thank you all. We hope you have found this session both interesting and useful. And I wish you every success in whatever methodology you choose to adopt. Goodbye and good luck.